Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Midweek program at the J.C. Raulston Arboretum. My name is Blake, and I'm the Education Assistant here at the Arboretum, and today we are on our gathering lawn right behind the Weeping Walk because there is a lovely Albizia julibrisson right behind me. This cultivar is a lovely weeping variety of a tree that people generally think of as very weedy, and interestingly enough, due to this plant's weeping habit, it doesn't really weed around our garden all too much. Those are just some of the wonderful reasons why you might consider planting cultivars of plants. But for our program today, we've got our director, Mark Weathington, here, who's going to go over what is a cultivar and why you should care. And like I said, there's lots of reasons why to care. So this should be a very interesting program. Those of you joining us on YouTube, please like this video and subscribe to our channel, and feel free to leave a comment down below. And with the announcements out of the way, I can pass things over to Mark to teach us about what is a cultivar and why we should care.
All right. Thank you. I appreciate that. This is, well, I was going to say it's an exciting topic. I don't know that it's an exciting topic for many people, but it's an important one for us. We sometimes talk about these terms. We throw them out, cultivar, you hear nativar, you hear, forms, varieties, clones, and some of these things mean something. Some of them don't really mean anything. Some of them mean the same thing. But we, as a botanic garden, want to be correct about things. And we were just talking before we started this about how, why do you need to know these, Latin names and cultivars and things like that? And if you travel at all, if you go out of the country, and you go to another garden and you see something you like, if they didn't have the scientific names, which includes cultivar, you wouldn't be able to know what it was. I spent some time in the Ecuadorian rainforest at a village that in a biological hotspot, and in that village, over the years, there had been botanists and ornithologists and zoologists staying there. And so I walked around this village with somebody who spoke a little bit of Spanish and Chapalachi. I speak very, very little Spanish, cerveza, por favor, making up probably 3/4 of my Spanish, and certainly no Chapalachi. And we would go through, and he would point at something, and he would say, Solanaceae capsicum esculentum. That was a tomato. I mean, I knew it was a tomato, but they were growing that, with peppers or with other trees, things that I didn't know at all. He would be able to communicate with that with me. So that's why we use these scientific nomenclature. Now, I'm not going to go into a whole nomenclature talk, but we have to hit a little bit. So I brought some little signs out here. This is what you see when you're out in our garden. And so the Latin part of the name is this. Which one did I get now? Scilla peruviana, the Peruvian squill. So Scilla is the genus name. Peruviana is the specific epithet, sometimes called species. So Scilla peruviana is the species of plant that we're talking about, and that is the Latin name. And if you are interested in Latin names, you can go in deep dives into things like the International Code of Botanical Nomenclature. This is an old edition. It has been updated. It's online now. But when we talk about cultivars, we go in here and go to page 39, and hybrids, including those arising in cultivation, may receive names as provided in Appendix 1. We won't go back into Appendix 1 for here, but there's the start. We're getting some weather here. We'll see how this goes. So, there you have the genus and species. So the cultivar is nothing more than, let me get a definition for you, from the International Code of Nomenclature for Cultivated Plants, which came after the code came out. And these books, very esoteric, available online now, the newer editions. But the cultivar is the basic taxon of cultivated plants. Article 2.2, here we go. The cultivar is a taxon or selection that has been selected for a particular attribute or combination of attributes, and that is clearly distinct, uniform, and stable in its characteristics, and that when propagated by appropriate means retains those characteristics. So what does that mean? A cultivar is a form of a species, say Scilla peruviana. Maybe if there was a white form that you grew, you were growing these out from seed, and one popped up white instead of the normal blue, you might put a name on it. You might call it, Mark's Little White Splendor. And if that's the case, then that's a cultivar. It is distinct. Now, in order for it to be a good cultivar, you have to be able to keep that same trait. So you have to be able to propagate that bulb, divide it, grow it out from seed, do whatever, and have it retain that. So when we put a name on a cultivar name, we put it in single quotes, not two quotes, but single quotes. So this was, what is our common name on it? A snowbush, Sarissa japonica, which we call snowbush. Beautiful little shrub from Asia, japonica, although also from China, because that's where this was. We collected this in China. We grew it out and really didn't think much of it other than it was a wild collected species. It was not as pretty as many of the ones that are in cultivation. It actually had smaller flowers than a lot of them. But as it got older, we noticed that it was just absolutely covered with pollinators every year. It's one of the best pollinator plants we have in the garden. So while there are showier ones like Sarissa japonica apple blossom and Sarissa japonica white swan, we put the cultivar name Bumblebee Delight on this one. That was former garden manager Doug Ruin's name for it. We like that. And we put it in single quotes. And really anybody can name a cultivar. It is just a cultivated variety, cultivar. So, like the definition said, a cultivar needs to be distinct. This is distinct. We've grown many Sarissa japonica. This one was, for whatever reason, very distinctly more attractive to pollinators than other ones we had grown. So it might have been that it had a different growth habit. It was, you get a plant and it's weeping. You grow out seed and it's weeping. A lot of those plants get named. They can be bred for the different characteristics to have, to be weeping, to have purple leaves, to have, whatever. And those are all valid reasons to name a cultivar. Now, I'm going to show a couple things that are, or something that's not a cultivar. Sometimes there are plants that have, a lot of the different plants have kind of the same characteristics. So with snowbell, Styrax japonicus, there are some weeping pink forms that are not distinct from each other, and they're just all lumped into what's called a group. And this you don't see for sale very often, things with these group names like Rubra pendula group, but if you're in a botanic garden, you may see that. There's also, this has a variety, Rhodia chinensis, variety chinensis. So it's got a botanical variety. That is something that occurs in the wild, this variety. There's other forms of Rhodia chinensis. This is an especially nice large form, so it was given the cultivar name Green Panda. So I'm kind of saying all this so you get where you can name these plants. We like to look at plants, and as horticulturists, we're always looking for what's unusual. I say that what's the difference between botanists, they all want things to be kind of the same. We always look for those edge cases, the ones that grow bigger or smaller or have a different color flower or contorted or weeping or things like that. And we give those all cultivar names. So we've had homeowners who've come to us and brought plants and said, is this something different? Is it interesting? Sometimes we say yes, sometimes we say no, sometimes we say we need to grow it for a while. But we often give those a variety name, a cultivar name. And variety and cultivar are often used interchangeably when we talk about them, although as we see here, variety does have a botanical meaning. Not enough to be a different species, but enough to distinguish it from another plant. So, who gets to name these plants? The truth is, anybody can put a cultivar name on a plant. It just has to be different and distinct from the species. So that can sometimes mean that it's very obvious. Instead of an upright plant, it's weeping. Very obvious. Instead of having a blue flower, it has a white flower or a red flower. Very obvious. Sometimes it's only obvious after you've grown a plant for a while. And there are folks I know who went through Texas when they had that polar vortex through Texas, and it just got frigid cold down there, 4 years ago, right around this time, 4 years ago, it went through. And they went down there after that and were looking at things like the palm trees that were growing around there and some other plants to see if any didn't show damage. And some of those plants that maybe didn't show damage, that are more cold hardy than all the other ones around there, those they'll probably want to start propagating them, growing them, seeing if they retain that cold hardiness, and they may get a cultivar name to them. Or sometimes a plant we find it's a little more drought tolerant. There's a sugar maple called Green Mountain that I never could tell the difference between it and any other sugar maples. And finally, doing some digging, found out that it's a more drought tolerant form. Now, a lot of people say, well, it's a better green, but the truth is, it's just a more drought tolerant form, which is great if you know that that's what you're dealing with. So why does this matter for you? Well, it may or may not matter. At my home garden, I don't have labels like this, but I do have little labels with all my plants, and I have records of all my plants and what they are, and I want to know what they are fully. I don't want to have 20 Japanese maples. I want to have one Acer palmatum Bihu and one Acer palmatum Geisha Gone Wild and one Acer palmatum Germain's Gyration. I want to know what they all are. That's part of my enjoyment of gardening. If it isn't part of your enjoyment of gardening, you don't have to. You don't have to do that. So, going a little bit deeper in these, a lot of times when we are putting cultivar names in, again, single quotes, those cultivars, a lot of times these are hybrid plants, and either the parentage is very complex, sometimes more than one species that goes in there. A cross is made with a hybrid, and then another plant comes in and those cross, and so there are 3 parentages in there. Or sometimes we don't know who all the parents are. Something arises as a seedling in the garden. So it used to be we would put, like in this instance, Epimedium X hybridus and then a cultivar name. That's really gone out of favor. We don't do that. We just put Epimedium and then we'll put the cultivar name. So Epimedium Domino in this case, which is a really vigorous, nice form with pretty large spurred flowers. You'll see this when you look at names, just the genus and that name. You see that a lot with things that are hybrids. Now, there are some things that are much like cultivars, but are presented in different ways. And actually, I've got 2 here for us, and different. This is not part of a botanical name like a cultivar. So different places do this differently. This is how we do it. This is what we call a descriptor in the name. So this Fatsia polycarpa was a huge, we saw this in Cornwall in England, and it had massive, massive leaves. They were 3 feet across. Never seen anything like that. And I've seen them in Taiwan all over the place. I was told they get that big in a specific spot in Situ, Taiwan. And so we just put on it Situ giant form, so we would know it was different than the other forms we grow. Now, we've been growing this for quite a while, but we are still kind of we grew it from seed. So these are all seedlings, and none of the seedlings have been very vigorous or very large. They've been different, but if one of those seedlings that we're growing winds up being really big and maybe having some hardiness to it and really show, we would probably put a true cultivar name on it. As it is, it may go by the wayside and die out with just this descriptor name on it because it may not be good. Sometimes we have a descriptor when it's a plant that is different and distinct, but nobody's ever put a cultivar name on it. This one, Hydrangea serrata Wilson 7820.
That's right.
7820. This is actually one of my all-time favorite Japanese mountain hydrangea. Japanese mountain hydrangea is a little smaller than the big leaf hydrangeas, smaller leaf, smaller flowers, but a little bit tougher and just more delicate, not quite as big and blousy. Well, this is a more compact form than what you normally see in the garden. And it was collected by Ernest Wilson, and it was his 7,820th collection. And it's just been floating around in the trade as Wilson 7820. In more modern times, this probably would have been given a name quicker, Wilson's Little Darling, China Gem, whatever it is. But it never got that. And most people don't want to put a name on somebody else's plant. So it kind of goes that way. It's unfortunate because nobody really grows Wilson 7820. Even though it's a fantastic plant. We sometimes propagate it and distribute it, and people take it home and plant it, and if we put China Gem as the name, they probably, those crazies like me would note that down and put it in there. Wilson 7820, they may not do that. I do, but not everybody. Going a little bit deeper into the nomenclature piece. Here we start getting into some interesting things going on with plant names in modern times. So, rhododendron Tyler Morris. You will have a hard time finding rhododendron Tyler Morris for sale with that name, at least in big and bold on the front of the label. What you will find is Southgate Radiance rhododendron, which is part of the Southern Living collection of plants. And Southgate Radiance, or rhododendron Tyler Morris, is a heat-tolerant big leaf rhododendron. It is a great plant for our area where we kill most big leaf hydrangeas. It's an awesome plant. And it was one from the Morris Arboretum. They named it Tyler Morris. Very heat tolerant. More Phytophthora resistant is really what that translates to. And Southern Living said, oh, hey, this is a great plant. We want to put it in our collection. And they started a Southgate collection of heat tolerant rhododendron for the South. So there are various ones. There's Tyler Morris. There's Janet Blair is another one. But when you go and you look at the big showy label on the pot, it'll say rhododendron Southgate Radiance for Tyler Morris, and Southgate something else for Janet Blair, and Southgate. There are several of the Southgate ones. So most people would look at this because everywhere they look, they'll see Southgate Radiance and think Southgate Radiance is the cultivar. It's actually Tyler Morris. But in the way we sell plants nowadays, sometimes that cultivar name is not as sellable as others. Southgate Radiance sounds really nice, Radiance, but Tyler Morris does not sound like a big, pretty pink flowered rhododendron to most people. I don't know Tyler Morris. I'm not, no shade thrown. Another one. This is another thing that people are doing very commonly now is when they introduce a new plant, they want to protect it. there are a couple of ways of protecting a plant. You can patent a plant. Plant patent costs, $20,000. You got to write up a description that shows that it is distinct and different and worthy of being patented. And if you patent it, you can control it. Nobody can propagate that plant legally unless they have your permission. And it may be to get your permission, you charge them a royalty. And that is often why patented plants are a little more expensive. It may be a 25-cent royalty per plant. It may be a $5 royalty per plant. It really just depends. To get around that, a cheaper way of doing it that people think is a protection, it's not really, is to give a cultivar that is a nonsense name. Now, in these old codes of botanical nomenclature I showed, that was the stipulation was that the cultivar name must be a fancy name, not in Latin, if it was introduced after 1959. So if you see things with Latinized names like alba instead of white, or pendulinana for a weeping dwarf plant, those, to be truly acceptable under the code, which has no enforcement, those would, after 1959, you would not be able to put those on a new plant. You'd have to put, Little Cascade or something like that instead of pendulinana. But with the newer systems, people have started putting these nonsense names on, like SPG. It's SPG 3015. And it just so happens because I know this was a group called Southern Plant Group, and it was mostly plants from Japan that were being given names. And so they put the nonsense name on there. And technically legally, the cultivar name is free to use for anybody. It is a scientific name. So you can grow this plant and propagate it, and anything as SPG 3015. But then they trademarked Gold Doubloon and marketed as Gold Doubloon. It's a gold leaf gardenia. And so you could grow this, but with that trademark Gold Doubloon name, you need permission to use that trademark name. You can't just use it. So you could take this plant, SPG 3015, use that cultivar name and put your own, a different trademark name on it if you wanted. There's no stopping you from doing that. But it's a way of nurseries would do this in order to try to have some control over who was propagating it so that they would get some royalties, that kind of thing. It's really not how, and this is a whole nother talk, really not how trademarks are supposed to be used. Trademarks are not tied to items. The example that we often use is Tylenol. You have never taken Tylenol. Tylenol as a product does not exist. You take Tylenol cold and sinus, Tylenol extra strength, Tylenol headache and pain relief, Tylenol, nighttime, whatever, Tylenol PM. Tylenol is trademarked, but there is no product called Tylenol. So actually, the more correct way to do this is this way that the Southgate did. Southgate is trademarked. It's a series. There are multiple Southgate plants. What I would love to see with people who are introducing new plants who want to do this is if this rhododendron were named Radiance as a cultivar name, and then it's the Southgate Radiance, or Southgate, Beauty and Southgate, do that. But, this is where commerce and science, kind of buckle at each other. Now, cultivar names, plants only get one cultivar name. So this plant that was brought back from Japan with no name on it, well, we found out at some point later that it actually does have a name in Japanese. It's Ogan no Hana. Ogan means gold and That usually means the gold from Hana, which may have been a person or a place, but Ogon no Hana. So that is the correct name. SPG is not a valid cultivar name because it already had a cultivar name. You shouldn't change that. Now, we can still put gold doubloon on there. You don't have to, but if you don't want to, because it doesn't matter, but you can. So that's a lot in a quick bit of time. So let's look at a couple of examples of other ways people are talking about cultivars. And this is where you may care or may not care. A term that's being used that has no basis in botany is nativar. A nativar, that's a term for a cultivar of a native plant. And there are some people who are very much against these. They think we should only be growing the wild species, these native plants and not these nativars. And they have a point, and they have they're right and they're wrong. If we all grow the same nativar of whatever native plant, we're all growing one clone of it. If we grow the genetics are all the same. Whereas if we're all growing, seed grown wild plants, we have lots of different genetics. So it all depends on what your goal is. Years ago, I worked with a garden. We had a native plant garden, and they were up in arms about the cultivars we were using kind of at the entry to this native plant garden. And I was trying to explain to them, they didn't like this, that we were using a cultivar of flowering dogwood was one that they really had a problem with. And I said, this is no different than if you were growing a seed-grown wild plant and it wound up having bigger flowers and growing for over a longer season than the other ones, and you took cuttings of it or divided it and shared it with your friends and passed it around that way because it's a really good plant. The only difference is a name is put, once a name is put on it, that name can follow it around. And so we know what it is. I think that's beneficial. There's some work that was done, and we've had some talks about it before that touched on this, but a plant that people like, this is an Asian plant, not a native one, but is paperbark maple. Beautiful plant, beautiful exfoliating coppery bark on it, beautiful fall color. And a lot of them were not really doing well. We're kind of going downhill, and some researchers from some botanic gardens went around and did genetic work on the plants that were in cultivation and found that they really only were wild collected a couple of times. And so there's this genetic bottleneck, and everything that was produced from those plants, seed produced from those plants, the genetics were getting, it was a little too inbred, and plants were not as vigorous as the original introductions were. And so if we had known, if when it was collected one time, if it was called, not just given a Wilson 7820 name, but it was called, Beijing Star, and that we would, and everything propagated from that, we would know that no, there aren't 100 gardens with 100 different paperbark maples in there. There's 95 gardens all with Beijing Star and 5 gardens with some different ones. That's looking at cultivars and nativars from a conservation point of view. It helps track the genetics. And in fact, often now, if we collect a plant from the wild and it's from a different area, like say we're in the Southwest, in the hill country of Texas, and we go collect something at Dripping Springs, which is a real hot spot for things, we will often just put a cultivar Dripping Springs. And that is kind of to track those genetics so that we know what it is, and we can see that it's different from this other one by the name. So we may ask, how do you know cultivars? How do you know what they are? We use a lot of resources. There are old print ones. This is a source book of cultivar names. This does not give you cultivar names. This tells you what books have the best kind of considered the most professional names. Also, there are some groups that are the registrars. So I'm on the Magnolia Society International Board. The registrar for magnolias is a member of Magnolia Society. Some botanic gardens are kind of the holders of that. One nice thing with books is the cultivars, since they don't change, even an old book like this, which is the World Checklist of Conifers, so this is 1993 edition, lists conifers. It's in a pretty book. It just lists names, maybe who introduced it, if that's available. It's just a list, but most everything in here is correct. Now, there's a whole lot that's been added since 1993, so it's not up to date, but that doesn't make it out of date either. Some other books, and you could go, very specific, hollies, maples, all these books, that are about specific plants that list cultivar after cultivar. And we use this. We go back in these books and identify things that have lost IDs. Now, these are books, but talking about websites, these are both through Lawrence Hatch, these cultivars books. Some he has like cultivars of Acuba. We work closely on that together. And then he has these cultivars of hardy perennials and cultivars of woody plants. But this is all online as well. Larry Hatch, it's the new ornamentals database online. So you don't have to buy the book. You can. I know a lot of us like to have the books in our hand, and his books are basically just his website in print form. His website is a pay website. So you do have to pay, but it's constantly updated. It's constantly being added to, and really, if you're a plant lover, it is pretty mind-blowing what he gets in there. And he goes back and does the history of a lot of these things. I mean, he digs into, like with his Acubas, he digs into their first introductions to the West from Japan. And tries to match up modern cultivars whose names have changed. He goes back through old catalogs of plants, and it's amazing what people were growing. But you can see, like in here, there's this, like an old listing from some old catalog or treatise on, in this case, Acuba. It's pretty fascinating, the work that he's doing. I kind of threatened when Blake saying I was going to read the definition of a cultivar and then say, so why should you care? You should. And I still stand by that. You should only care if you want to care. I feel like I bounced around a lot.
That's okay.
I did a lot of drive, but if there are questions or if there are things that you think I missed, Blake,
okay,
throw it at me.
Sure. Well, we'll start with a question that Mary had before the program started. She said, do you know anything about Taxus media smokestack, like where to find one, how wide it gets, and is there one at the JCRA?
Taxus media smokestack. No, I don't know anything about it. Having grown plenty of U's, Taxus is the U. I'm assuming smokestack, it's a narrow upright one. My guess is it's probably a great narrow upright one until it gets older, and then it probably splays out because it is almost certainly multi-stemmed, although perhaps not. I'm not what I'm familiar with.
Okay, fair enough. I mean, Texas don't usually do too well in this part of the world, so.
That is true. We go for the plum U's, not the true U's, the Cephalotaxus.
Indeed. Okie dokie. Susan says, but if everyone all over the world is naming cultivars, where is the one big book with all these cultivar names?
Honestly, Larry Hatch's New Ornamentals database. That is as comprehensive a source of cultivar named plants anywhere that I know of. Some other good ones, the Missouri Botanic Gardens, Mobot has a really good listing. The North Carolina Extension Toolbox is very good. The JCRA website, in conjunction with our photograph collection, is pretty good. But I really think Larry Hatch is as comprehensive as you can get. He does everything from houseplants to trees and shrubs. And he was JC, one of JC's students, he was here at the Arboretum. If you're a longtime member of the Arboretum, you may remember the extensive ground cover juniper collection. That was Larry Hatch.
Well, but so you mentioned like the registrar for the magnolia cultivars. So there's no like monolithic entity that tracks all cultivars everywhere, all over the place.
No monolithic thing that tracks all cultivars every place. And here's the thing, there is no legality around it. Now, if we name a plant here at the Arboretum, in an ideal world, with ideal amounts of time, I would write up a botanical description of that cultivar, and I would send it to Hort Technology, Hort Science, and it would be published. It would be a refereed published paper, maybe just a couple pages long. I would get credit for, publishing, so I don't perish, but I don't have to do that. I could say we were to name a magnolia here, like Serendipity. We named Serendipity here. I should, as a member as a board member of the Magnolia Society International, should make sure I send information about that plant and the pictures to the registrar, the Magnolia registrar. In reality, what happens is active registrars will comb through catalogs and Hort Technology and all these places and look for these new cultivars in order to add to their checklists. And some societies are pretty good about that. Some societies try to keep very good records. The Magnolia Society, camellias, daylilies, iris are pretty good. A lot of them, the rest are not. And if you're a nurseryman, most likely you don't even know that, where those are. And so there is no central clearinghouse where all those names ever pass through. The reason that Larry's website is so good is because he and some other folks who work with him spend an extraordinary amount of time going through websites, and both new and old, and visiting gardens and taking pictures. Larry and I, right before COVID hit, had plans to go up to Ohio, go to the Dawes Arboretum, and take a bunch of pictures of some things there to add to the website, and for me to connect with some people and things like that. So it takes a lot to do that.
Sure. Okay. Susan's also asking, are all cultivar names in English?
Are all cultivar names in English? Well, as we showed, some of them are in no language, like the SPG 315-015. But no, wherever the plant is from, we have Ceanothus glordiversi or Ogon nohana. They can be in any language that is not Latin if it's post 1959 as a name, but yeah, they're named all over the place. Now, if it's something that's going to sell, that may sell big, they'll want it in English because English is the most widely spoken language. Here's going back to those nonsense names. Some countries put more restrictions around cultivar names. They're not supposed to, but if you want to get plant breeder's right, which is basically a plant patent in Europe, they have to approve the cultivar name. They're fine with it being nonsense, but I know of somebody who had patented the plant here in the U.S. and were trying to patent it in Europe with the plant breeder's rights, and it was Tom Ranney here at NC State with his Invincible Spirit Hydrangea arborescens, and the cultivar name was meant to be Spirit. It was Hydrangea arborescens, Spirit was the cultivar. Trademark was Invincible. And there were going to be, Invincible Spirit, which was white, Invincible Ruby, Invincible, it was a whole series of them. Well, there is a Hydrangea White Spirit. And the European plant breeders' rights folks said, you can't have this cultivar name. The cultivar name, which they're not really supposed to be able to tell you that, but science and legalities. So the patent lawyer said to Tom, I told you so. And it became... Hydrangea arborescens NCHA 1, I think. with the trademark series name Invincible, and then Spirit is what we call a trade designation. It's just a name. So now if you are a plant breeder and you're patenting plants, more likely than not, you will give your plant a nonsense name, and because that keeps you from having problems in other countries. It's not my favorite, but it is the world we live in. So it becomes, those trade designations become more important.
Yeah. Speaking of, Joanne was wondering, why doesn't Southgate Radiance have a TM identification following the name?
So if I remember correctly, it would be Southgate, and it might be registered. It might need an R with a circle around it. We won't get into R's versus TMs. And it is not my responsibility, nor the responsibility of the Arboretum, to keep up with their trademarks or patent, or the patents, yes, trademarks and registered trademarks. That's not us. I have another one here. We actually used to, you can see that's got the little TM on there. We decided constantly we're not doing that because we don't have to. I can write Coca-Cola. I don't have to put the little R with a circle after it. Coca-Cola does, because if they don't do that and protect their name, then they lose it. But yeah.
No kidding. Okay, well, Nancy had a question. She says she was late entering in. Did Mark define a cultivar? And I'm sure you did, but I was running to grab umbrellas, Shirley, when that was happening. So,
all right, the official definition. A cultivar is a taxon, that just means a plant, that has been selected for a particular attribute or combination of attributes, and that is clearly distinct, uniform, and stable in its characteristics, and that when propagated by appropriate means retains those characteristics. So, which I'm glad you mentioned that, because there were some things I wanted to mention in here. So it needs to be distinct, it needs to be stable. And this is kind of interesting, because there are some plants that are grown that actually are not stable, that are two different cultivars. There is, and this was one that was pointed out to me by my horticultural hero, Roy Lancaster, back when I was a young horticulturist and he was visiting the garden I worked at. There is a flat growing Sequoia sempervirens. I think it's Adpressa, maybe. I can't remember the cultivar, but it's an old cultivar. And it grows flat on the ground. And it'll grow that way for 10 or 20 years usually. But at some point, it'll shoot straight up. And that, when it goes straight up, that's Cantab. It's a different cultivar. And you can propagate Cantab and it'll just grow straight. You can propagate Adpressa and it'll go across until it goes up. So things can change. There are conifers that are juvenile, that the cultivars are juvenile. Or eucalyptus, where it's juvenile. The leaves are long and narrow, but they can become mature and they'll change their shape, which is normal on a eucalyptus, but that's a different cultivar, which I'm a little off on. Typically, we want cultivars that are completely stable and that we propagate typically asexually. So we divide them if they're spreading, we root cuttings of them, we put them in tissue culture, or we graft them. So those are stable. But there are seed cultivars as well. There are things that will come true from seed, so you can grow those out from seed and they retain the cultivar name. So as long as they retain the characteristics, they can be propagated by seed.
And I'll just add to that, the word cultivar is a portmanteau of cultivated and variety.
Right.
So it's a variety that's been cultivated that wouldn't exist were it not for human cultivation. So that's just the quick and easy way to remember.
Right. And technically, it's not supposed to be a cultivar if it is found in the wild. But that was something taxonomists thought of, and that doesn't really work. If you are out in the woods and you come across a weeping, contorted, blue-flowered red bud. There is no way to designate that as something. We've moved away from the botanical forma and variety, so you kind of have to give it a cultivar name if you're going to move it into cultivation.
And Stacy just popped up with a question. So a sport is not a cultivar, or a broom even?
A sport or a broom. So a sport is when you get, say, on your camellia, one branch will all of a sudden be variegated. It'll come out and be variegated or have a different color flower on it or different growth habit. A sport is not a cultivar.
Sure.
If you propagate that sport,
yes,
and it stays stable and distinct, then you can name that as a cultivar.
Yeah.
And the source of that cultivar is that sport on the tree. But it's the kind of the propagating it and having it be distinct is where, and it's a cultivar when you put a name on it.
For sure. And same for a witch's broom. You find a really tight growing thing, it's just a witch's broom, but as soon as a horticulturist tries to propagate it, makes entirely new plants with it that are stable and maintain those characteristics, then you've got yourself a cultivar.
Exactly.
Cool. Well, that is all of the questions that we have for today. So thank you so much, Mark, for taking us through this.
You are welcome. I feel like I'm skipping over. I'm like, that was 85%. We could go real deep on that other 15%.
That's okay.
Let me read you some case studies from Taxonomy of Cultivated Plants.
And while Mark is doing that, I will thank all of you for joining us today on the Midweek program. We will be back next Wednesday at 3 o'clock. We will be doing Mahonia Madness, where Mark and Tim will be going over all the fun Mahonias we have here in the garden. So make sure you join us for that. We will see you all next time. Y'all take care.